Welcome, I'm Pastor Jack. This is the third of three parts in our study of Islam, part of an overarching study making sense of world religions. The first week we looked at the pillars, the 5 pillars of Islam, and also the 6th unofficial pillar, jihad, and what each of them meant. There was one statement of belief, that was the first pillar, that God is God and Muhammad is his prophet, his messenger. And then the practices of prayer 5 times a day, the tithe, the journey to Mecca, and the celebration of Ramadan, the month of fasting, and a big celebration at the end of that. And then jihad, which is not one of the pillars, but it really means the same thing we would mean by the faith journey, that sense of striving to be more faithful, letting the faith come and fill your life more and more. Jihad is more of a, it's a life process, an internal spiritual process. Though for some, and in many situations, it has been seen as physical armed resistance to enemies of Islam. Then we looked at Muhammad, how his life, where he grew up in 7th century Arabia, how it had shaped him and his revelations through the angel Gabriel from God, gave text to the Quran. Those visions became the Quran. Though Muhammad himself was illiterate, he memorized and recited those visions he had received, and then he later had scribes dictate them, but it was his memory, his recitation of those visions that gave Islam its holy scripture. So we're going to proceed now with the third and final part of our look at Islam. Muhammad's death in 632 AD led the 85% of Muslims who are considered Sunnis to choose the 4 rightly guided caliphs, that is, the 4 people who would succeed Muhammad. Muhammad expanded the Muslim state to all of Arabia by the time of his death. The first 4 caliphs, those who followed him, lived simple and righteous lives, and they strove hard for the religion of God. They did their best to be faithful. Their justice was considered impartial. Their treatment of others was kind and merciful. They were one with the people, not set above them. The first among equals, we might say. Later caliphs after these 4 assumed the role and airs and manner of kings and emperors. The true spirit of the equality of ruler and ruled diminished under them to a considerable extent in the political life of Muslims following those first 4 successors to Muhammad. All right, the rightly guided caliphs were Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's choice for advisor, and also his father-in-law, the father of Khadija, his wife. He was the first caliph following Muhammad's death. A split occurred because the minority group, the 15% called Shias, wanted Ali, who was Muhammad's closest living relative, his first cousin, to become the caliph. And that was the minority group, and it caused a split that's still with us today. So Ali was passed over 3 times to be successor, but finally elected some 35 years later, sadly to be assassinated just a few years after that. Ali's son, Hussein, was killed in a skirmish with the Sunni army. The martyrdom of Hussein is still remembered and reenacted, especially by Shias. Umar was the second, and Uthman, the third of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. Ali was the 4th and last of this group. With the death of Ali, the first and most notable phase in the history of the Muslim people came to an end. All through this period, it had been the book of God, the Quran, and the practices of his messenger, Muhammad, who had guided the leaders in this time. It was the time when the ruler and the ruled, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak, were uniformly subject to divine law. We're fond of saying in our own culture that no one is above the law, and that is exactly how the first four rightly guided caliphs lived in terms of the divine law. It was a time of freedom and equality, of consciousness of God and true humility. It was a time of social justice, which recognized no privileges, and an impartial law, which accepted no pressure groups or vested interests. We might say it sounded a bit like paradise, though I'm sure it was much more difficult than we think. After Ali's death, Muawiyah assumed the caliphate, and he was Ali's son. The caliphate became hereditary, passing from one king to another. So I guess in that regard, the Shias prevailed because they had wanted the hereditary succession all along. Umayyad dynasty began in 661 and lasted till 750. It emerged from the conquered remainder of the Persian Empire and also half of the Byzantine Empire. Remember, the Byzantine Empire came out of the movement by Constantine of Rome, and in a sense a second Rome, to Constantinople, which later became Istanbul. It marked a transitional time from the four rightly guided caliphs to what we might call imperial Islam. The Umayyad achievements and their wealth brought conflict with traditional ways of Arab life. There were several splits, including a split between the Sunni and the Shia. This dynasty ended after there was a slave revolt in 750. The next Islamic empire was called the Abbasid Empire. It lasted from 750 to 1258 and represented an Islamic community that was wealthy and powerful. There were great cultural achievements and strong centralized government. Great Muslim contributions were made to law, to theology, to philosophy and art, to literature, to medicine, to mathematics, science, and architecture. We use Arabic numbers, our number system, and they developed out of this time. Muslim scholars learned from and extended teachings of the insights of ancient Greek philosophy. And as Europe emerged from its own dark ages, it had to learn from the teachings and other advances of Islam. And so ironically, so much of what enabled the Western European culture to move forward had to do with all of the knowledge that was preserved by the Islamic Empire. The splintering of Islamic culture was affected by the Crusades, a series of wars that were started by the Pope and the Western Christendom. The first in 1095 and lasted till 1453. And at that point in 1453, Constantinople fell to Islam, and the name was changed to Istanbul, and it became a Muslim city, part of a Muslim culture. The Muslim-Christian confrontation still colors the relationship between Muslims and Christians today. The Christians in the West saw Islamic expansion as a religious and political threat. And the Crusades ended, as I said, in 1453 when Constantinople fell to the Turks. It was renamed Istanbul and became the seat of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted from 1281 to 1924. Other Islamic empires included the Persian Safavid in 1501 to 1722, and the Indian Mughal Empire, 1520 to 1857. Don't worry, you won't have to know those numbers on a test. During the 18th century, there was a decline of the Islamic empires and the rise of European colonialism. All through this time, especially as the empires fell, there were many Islamic revivalist movements, 17th, 18th century particularly, in Asia, in Africa, and in India. New Islamic states emerged in Arabia and North Africa, in Nigerian, Libyan, and Sudan cultures. Many of these efforts involved a desire to return to pure prayer and praise practices of Islam. And I have to say that sounds so much like many of the revivalist movements within Christianity as well. The revivalist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries were prompted by internal weakness in Muslim countries and the external threat of European colonialism. By the late 20th century, Islamic revivalism was a reaction to Western exploitation of Islamic cultures. There were several newly created states, and they had artificial boundaries following the First World War. These included Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Not traditional boundaries, but boundaries that were just peremptorily placed there by the winners of the First World War. Hopes that Western modernism would actually work in Islamic countries were shattered in the 1950s and 60s, and the traumatic 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which lost to the Arabs the city of Jerusalem, sparked change, including the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the rise in Islamic fundamentalism in an effort to throw off Western oppression. So you get the feel of what was going on here. As Western Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, Islamic culture was very strong and very advanced. Gradually, as Western cultures got stronger and colonial expansion happened, the Arab cultures, the Islamic cultures began to weaken. And so this prompted the Western European cultures to exploit those countries, and that prompted reaction and a pushback against that type of exploitation and oppression. The late 20th century revival of Islam, since that time, more Muslims became more personally observant. They began to take their faith much more seriously and personally. New Islamic governments were established in Iran, Sudan, and Afghanistan. There's also been a rise in radical Islamic organizations practicing terrorism. The modern nation states created by the West in the Middle East after World War I did not respect traditional boundaries and borders. Colonial states won independence with strong Muslim influence. Modern Western-like states prospered while traditional Muslim states did not. In the 1960s and 70s, a series of wars and riots ended this whole process. Modern states lost their credibility among the people. There was a great questioning within Islam, and it led in many ways to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Disillusion with Western modernism led to a return of Islamic states. There was a quest for greater authority and authenticity in Islam, in politics and religion. Failures were attributed to not being faithful enough. Just like in ancient Israel, the prophet said the reason these bad things are happening is because you are not following God as you should. They were seen as departing in Islam from departure from the true faith. Strongmen, rulers, used Islamic symbols to strengthen their regimes. Gaddafi in Libya, Zia al-Haq in Pakistan, Sadat in Egypt, and Jafar Numayri in Sudan. Islamic candidates gradually began to win in elections. Most Muslim governments were authoritarian, traditional. Some radical Islamic groups actually began to attack the West. And there was conflict within Islam, conflict over the proper interpretation of the Quran. Traditional interpretations had been made in patriarchal cultures, and also within the context and in response to 7th century Arabian society, which had defined the role, meaning, and relevance of Islam to begin with. And so the struggle for the soul of Islam between conservatives and reformers, that is mainstream Muslims on the one hand and extremists on the other, evoked questions like who should interpret Islam, how reform should be achieved. Major issues included the proper relationship of religion to state and society, the proper role of Islamic law, the status of women and non-Muslims, relations with the West, and the compatibility of Islam with democracy. new opportunities for peace, democracy, expanded human rights, political, social, and economic empowerment, and an increasing acceptance in Western societies of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition all made these changes possible. Islam today has four general orientations, four groups of people. One is the secularists, in which religion is personal but excluded from politics and public life. Two, conservatives who follow past tradition and are wary of change. They consider it in many cases to be heresy. Third group would be mainstream lay activists who practice social and political activism based on a return to the fundamentals of the faith. And fourth, the Muslim Brotherhood's holistic understanding, spiritual and temporal, the spiritual world, the physical world. It's been a slow process to change traditional interpretations of Islamic law, for example, the role of women. Modern reformers distinguish between the divine law and the very human interpretation of that law, and they are more open to reinterpretation. And similar conflicts exist and have existed within Judaism and within Christianity. So who gets to interpret Islam today, for today? The ulama, scholars, and religious leaders, or is it the laity and the governments? What are the acceptable interpretations of Islam for the modern world? Can democracy be a fit within an Islamic state? What about the role of women? Sometimes new Islamic states use women to show their Islamic credentials by taking away rights, and that way saying, oh yeah, we're very traditional, you can trust us. Many women are fighting back by wearing the traditional headscarf and by returning to mosques for women's study and prayer groups, by actually becoming more involved in the faith. Women have begun writing and speaking out for themselves. In reality, the status of women in Muslim cultures varies greatly. Quranic verses that seem to oppress women come out of the context of 7th century culture in Arabia. Islam is trying to accomplish a transition to modernism, doing in a few decades what it took Christianity and Judaism centuries to accomplish. The primary issue is tradition versus reform. That is conservative versus progressive. Muslims have been present in the United States and American culture since before the 19th century. African American Islam emerged in the early 20th century with Nation of Islam leader Wallace D. Fard Muhammad. He taught liberation from the Quran and from the Bible. With his mysterious disappearance in 1934, Elijah Muhammad built a national organization. It was not mainstream Islam at first, but then it became more observant. Originally, Nation of Islam was its own thing, but gradually they became more devout traditional Muslims. The 9/11 hijacking sadly shattered the hopes and dreams of many Muslims for peace. For Muslims, the 21st century requires educating, engaging in dialogue with, and finding new ways in which to work within the West and global civilization. This is so important. We each need to give ourselves to the cooperative spirit. I hope that this insight into Islam helps you understand it just a little better and be more of a voice for cooperation. Thank you so much. God bless. I'll see you next time.